Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. Jared Mack, Eric Scopel, I'm Matt Preem. All three of us on this show today, breaking down the matchup that's now set for the quarterfinals of the college football playoffs played at the Rose Bowl, which is number one seed Oregon taking on a rematch of number 8 Ohio State, who looked pretty damn good last night at home with 70,000 Buckeye fans and 30,000 Tennessee fans who made a long drive to see an ass kicking by Ohio State. 42-17, 21-point jump in the first quarter. And I feel like this was probably Ohio State's, they played their best game of the year. And it came at the right time. For whatever reason, Tennessee was deciding to go single coverage against Ohio State's receivers, and Jeremiah Smith looked like the freshman All-American that he is. 2 tutties, over 100 yards. Will Howard looked really good. And I think the first initial reaction, I had phone calls from my parents, my friends texted, like, oh my God, this sucks. Ohio State's unbelievable. But, we knew this. We knew Ohio State was going to be a good team. We knew Oregon would have to play a good team at some point in the college football playoffs. It's here. And it's going to be a matchup that's probably the best game of the entire college football season again, of the mid-October game.
Yeah, this was a classic the first time these teams played, and I don't think there's any question that it has the makings of another in the repeat here, in the rematch. And, we saw yesterday what Ohio State can be and how dangerous this team is, and we can get into some of the reasons why they kind of embarrassed Tennessee and whether or not we think Oregon – or I guess what Oregon can do differently, because I think there are some things, and Matt kind of alluded to it a second ago. But Ohio State put on display what they can be, and Oregon already knew how talented this team was, how tough of an out it was from its first game. Let's not forget, this was a 1-point game where, if not for some pretty impressive gamesmanship by Oregon, and I would say kind of a Chris Webber-esque brain fart by Will Howard, this is a Ohio State win, perhaps, So these teams we knew that, when this matchup was a possibility, we knew this was going to be potentially a really scary opponent to meet. And now it's here. And I think the fun part of this is you win this game, you beat Texas, maybe, if that's who you face in the semis, and you have to face Georgia in the championship game. There's no questions remaining about who's the best team in the country. You eliminate the theory of, you missed all the good teams, because if there's one thing you can certainly say at this point, looking at how the brackets played out, Oregon's not going to be missing the good teams. They're going to be going straight head to head against the probably 3 of the best teams in the country this year, if everything plays out the way it looks like it might. And hey, maybe it's not the way you want it drawn up. Maybe you want the easier path. Maybe you feel like, the 8-9 sheet probably shouldn't include one of the 3 or 4 best teams in college football. All that can be true, but the path is set. And if you're Oregon, this is your opportunity to prove that you really are the best team and to show why you're the last unbeaten remaining.
Yeah, these are the 2 best teams in the country as far as I'm concerned. I had Georgia ahead of Ohio State for a lot of the season, but without Carson Beck, and I know he hasn't been great this year, but without your starting quarterback for the majority of the season going into the playoffs, I'm going to put this team ahead of them. They looked great last night. I watched most of the game. Didn't really feel like watching the second half because it was an absolute blowout. We all knew it was going to happen. When people asked if there was a chance for Tennessee, I would reply no, just because Nico Iamaleava, he's just not there yet. And he might get there, and he's got all the talent in the world and God-given talent, but he's just not there yet, and that's fine. You have another year of him with development in Josh Heupel's system, but it was very clear that Tennessee's offense relies heavily on the run game. Dylan Sampson's a hell of a running back, set a bunch of school records this year for Tennessee, and throwing the ball deep. That's why Dante Thornton, former Oregon Duck, led the team in receiving yards, but only had 25 receptions all year long. He was 20 yards a catch, basically. And Ohio State said, okay, cool, we're just going to stop both of those things because they have the personnel to do so. And on defense, like Matt said, they played man coverage against Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, with Will Howard, a 6-year quarterback. It was just dumb. That's not what Oregon did last time. They did the complete opposite. They just played zone coverage. They let them throw 6-7 yards underneath, and then they made tackles. They'll have to do something similar again this upcoming matchup. But this is why you play the games. This is why you play the sport of football. You want to play the best teams. And if you're anybody who's an Oregon fan who says that they don't want to play Ohio State, then that's kind of chickeny. Like you want to play the best teams. If you think you're the best team in the country, you have the chance to go out and prove it during the playoffs. That's the whole point of it all. And there's a lot of college football playoff talk recently, which has been incredibly dumb. Like again, the reason why Indiana and Clemson and all these guys that got blown out this weekend got into the playoffs is because they won. And
Exactly.
that's what Oregon has to do going forward. Obviously, it has to do going forward. Does it stink that you're the number one overall team in the country and then you have to play like the second best team in the country like in your first game in 3 weeks? Yeah, it's not great, but you're the number one team in the country. It shouldn't matter. You're 13. You're the only team to go 13-0 this year. So this is what you asked for. This is why. This is why you win 13 straight games. This isn't what if they wanted to lose last week against Penn State and get the 8 seed or the 7 seed, they could have done that. But you want to face these challenges head on, just like any other league.
We should also note, like Jared's already got the story up on Duck Territory that Oregon's the slight underdog. Dan Lanning says motivation is underrated, and he's lying through his teeth when he says that, because we've seen him deliver some unbelievable motivating speeches going into games, and you've now given Dan Lanning, just the number one team in the country, motivation. Like everyone is right now saying Ohio State's king, they're going to win, and Oregon's the team that won the earlier matchup. They're the only team, like Jared said, to go 13-0. They've beaten all the Big Ten teams that have been good this season. They've, except for Indiana because they weren't on the schedule, and they have 3 playoff wins, wins over playoff teams to their name this season. So like everyone's doubting them, and now you just gave Dan Lanning extra motivation. I'll be really excited to see, win or lose, just kind of the behind the scenes look that we get of him and his motivating tactics, because he's proven to be very good at that. And I think last night probably served as a wake-up call for Oregon. Like, hey, like this team is really good. This is what their potential is. You have to go in full scope with everything focused on beating Ohio State. Not that I thought there was ever going to be like an overlook, but it's just different when your opponent plays a really clean game going into your next, your matchup. And that's going to, Oregon's now going to have 10, 12 days to sit here and stew and watch and prepare, and it's going to be a fascinating game. I'm not going to come out here and say that Oregon's going to win easily, and I've got full confidence that this team's going to walk out of the Rose Bowl with a victory and just look unbelievably good. Like Ohio State has talent, and they have some of the best talent in the country at certain positions. It's going to be a struggle. There will be moments in this game where Oregon's trailing, but I just think you get back to the bigger picture for Oregon is they have been the most consistent team all season long. And you should not be, to Jared's point, you should not be woe is me. We have to play Ohio State in the quarterfinals. It sucks because it's the way the bracket shook out, but you're here for a reason, and that's why you're here. You are the best team in the country, and if you play like it, you should move on.
It's interesting you're talking about kind of the motivation and how it shifts like this. I think about where Ohio State was after that Michigan game and kind of the whole dialogue around that team. I think that played a big role. And I mean, obviously they're very, very talented, but that's like an Ohio State team that was really motivated and really clicked and had something to prove. And frankly, was strangely enough, maybe playing for Ryan Day's job. I know maybe not really, but like that kind of felt like some of the national discourse was like, is he going to get fired if they lose? Like you're hearing that all week. And now, to Matt's point, it sort of shifts a little bit in terms of what the narrative has been. I've already seen, it start to become, Oregon's going to have a really hard time with Ohio State. Not that that's not accurate. Or, maybe Ohio State, maybe they're the team that will be on the other side of the bracket waiting for Georgia or Penn State. And, not that I think you started seeing, kind of to Matt's point, a little bit of that national overlooking of Oregon. Not that people are disrespecting, but of just going, wow, that was so impressive what we saw from Ohio State on Saturday night. And it absolutely was impressive, as we've already established. I mean, they really were firing on all cylinders against the Tennessee team, which, as I think we all kind of realized going in, was going to be a little bit overmatched. But like, hey, maybe the SEC defense, maybe they'll be able to pull it together. This team hadn't been blown out this year, blah, blah, blah. Well, none of that really held true. And I think now the shoes are kind of on the other foot a little bit of here. Now Oregon's the team feeling like it's going to be responding to the national narrative that, this game is, whatever it's supposed to be. So I do think that part's interesting. I think the pressure, Who do you think has more pressure, Oregon or Ohio State, going into this game? That's just a question I just kind of dawned on me. Like, who would you identify as a team that you think has more?
Ohio State.
Still?
I don't know. I think there's both a lot of pressure.
Well,
Because this is I don't know if in my brain, there's not a clear winner in terms of more pressure.
I think we've heard all year Ohio State most talented team in college football, the $20 million NIL price tag to put this team together. And they've talked a lot about how Will Howard's already come out and said, like, that game just doesn't sit right with me, still doesn't sit right with me. We're gonna play better. I think, and I went back and looked at some of the questions that Ryan Day was asked, and someone just straight up was like, not to be rude or brash, I don't know how to ask this, but just where was that performance all year? Why have you not done that? And like, that's what happened last night for Ohio State. It's kind of been the expectation for them all season long, and they haven't lived up to that. And I'm curious of, like, they've shown they can do it now, and there's going to be a lot of expectations that, wow, you play like this, you beat everybody. And they've talked about how the Oregon game doesn't sit right with them. And so I think the pressure's on Ohio State to win. I mean, obviously, if Oregon loses, it's bad.
Sure.
Number one seed.
Yeah.
They're not trying to say there isn't any pressure, because Jared's right. There's a ton of pressure on both these teams, but everyone viewed Ohio State as like the team in college football at the start of the year. And this is their chance to prove that they are the team. And we'll see if they do it.
Yeah, and on the flip side, just for argument's sake, like, Oregon has a lot of pressure as well. Like, obviously they're the 13-0 number one overall seed. They get the extra bye. They get to play at the Rose Bowl. Like, everything is turning up for them except the matchup against Ohio State. They've already beat this team. Granted, it was at home at Autzen Stadium. They ran the ringer in their first season in the Big Ten. They are the best team in the country. I think that in any other year, that if like a 13-0 Alabama were the number one team in the country, I think there would be more pressure on them for some reason. I just think that there are points where Oregon is a little bit overlooked, and I'm not exactly sure why. It could be that this is a kind of a down year in college football. I wouldn't say that the level of play is up to the normal standard it has been for maybe the last decade. And that Oregon is taking advantage of that by winning every single game that they played this year, which is pretty good, if you ask me. I don't know. There was, like, in the Heisman voting, I don't mean to go on a tangent here, but only 2 times in college football history has the quarterback of an undefeated team not won the Heisman. And it's been J.J. McCarthy and Dylan Gabriel. So there are things that I think, like, Oregon's just a well-sounded team. They're not necessarily flashy in any way of the game, while Ohio State, not that they're a flashy team because they're physical and they play good defense, but they're a flashier team than what Oregon does. You can just watch the game from yesterday against Tennessee. I think there's a lot of pressure on both these teams. I think I would lean more Ohio State for some reason, even though they're not the number one team in the country and 13-0. But there's just this. I mean, they're 10-2 in the year. Like, if they lose to Oregon, like, this is still a disappointing season for Ohio State, which is a crazy concept to me, that 10-2 with a college football playoff victory. But they lost to Oregon, which happened, but the loss to Michigan outweighs everything that they've done this year up until this Rose Bowl game. So I think there is some pressure on them, and I think it's probably a little bit more than Oregon for some reason.
I think there's I mean, we don't have to carry this on too much longer, but just on the Oregon side, there is the element of, you went 13-0. Are you deserving of being the number one seed? Which I think everybody should say yes, based upon results. But then also, if they lose the game, it becomes, oh, here's Oregon again doing this thing where they're supposed to be so great. They lose in the big game, blah, 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 blah. Even though they've won multiple big games on big stages that would be qualifying, quote unquote, as the big game. So you can move the goalpost pretty easy if you want to diminish, I guess, this Oregon season. 2 things that, like, really stood out to me from this last night's game that I'm really curious about. In 10 days, this game feels like it should be sooner, but also feels like it should be not sooner, just based upon the breaks we're getting between these rounds. But I think the first one is, and you guys have touched on it already, but like in the first meeting between these teams, Oregon was a team that was able to get the ball over the top in the passing game. And I really think going back and rewatching it, which I've done this last week in preparation for this possibility, that was a really evenly matched game. And those two, actually there's three shots over the top, 2 to Evan, 1 to Tez, really feel like that might have been, I don't want to say the difference, but like one of the deciding factors in this game, and like pretty integral to Oregon's win in that game. And then you watch yesterday and you watch what Ohio State was able to do against Tennessee. And I go, it does feel like to me, if Ohio State is able to get it over the top a little bit, and maybe Ohio State finds some answers defensively and mitigates some of Oregon's success there, that could be where this game is decided. So I guess I'm curious on which receivers are able to have success. We know there's a ton of receiving talent in this game. There's a lot of NFL players in this game. That feels really critical, just kind of taking a look at it. And then the other thing is, like, back to Nico, who, Jared, you're right, he just doesn't look ready. But I think the thing that really stood out to me yesterday watching him was the pocket collapsed a lot, and Tennessee's offensive line really wasn't up for it. And I think we anticipate, based upon what Oregon has already done against Ohio State and what they are as an offensive line all year, that they'll be better in just protecting and giving more time to Dylan. But the thing that really stood out to me was when Nico was pressured and the pocket did collapse, he never tried to throw downfield, or very, very infrequently, right? It was tuck it, try to get upfield, try to make
awareness was poor.
His awareness was poor. The thing with Dylan that's been so impressive all year, and even going back to that first Ohio State game, but I think especially some of the plays like against Wisconsin on that fourth down throw to Terrence Ferguson, and Penn State, a couple of those throws downfield in big situations, is his ability to evade pressure, keep his eyes downfield, and deliver strikes. And I think, to me, that's another one that is what should give you some real optimism. This is going to look different than against Tennessee. Is like, for me, when Tennessee had the ball in offense, like especially when Sampson wasn't playing, because they were just nothing on first and second down, basically. Mm-hmm. But what really stood out to me was like when the pressure was there, Nico had no answers. And I think Oregon has much better answers. And I'll be very curious to see this time around, how much pressure Ohio State's able to get on Oregon's front, because Oregon's front should be better this time around, I think, than it was back then. Because you remember, that was like the third or fourth straight game with that same offensive line group. I think they should be more prepared this time. And then it's what does Dylan do? And he is the difference maker probably in this entire tournament, in terms of quarterback talent, in terms of experience playing in big games. Like, that's a huge edge that I hope doesn't get overlooked. If you're an Oregon fan, you're getting concerned, or if you're nationally looking at this game, like, don't overlook the fact that a lot of the success Ohio State had defensively last game was going against a quarterback who just really wasn't ready for the moment. We've already seen numerous times this year how Dylan, I guess, performs on the biggest of stages. And I think that's not low key, but I think really a crucial element of this is if he plays his best, Oregon will absolutely be in the middle of this game whenever this game is decided.
Well, you look at Ohio State's schedule, and this is the problem with these super conferences, is you get seasons where teams just don't play either overall elite teams like an Indiana. Like, Indiana 100% should have been in the playoffs. I'm not trying to argue against them, but they just didn't play anybody really of importance throughout the year.
Yeah.
And Ohio State, if you look at it, and you look at their schedule and you look at the teams that they've played, you would think, okay, Tennessee is probably going to be one of the better offenses that they have faced all season. It's a playoff matchup, right? Like, no. Like, Tennessee's passing game, Jared pointed out, Nico is just not good. He's not there yet. Tennessee had one game where they threw over 300 yards in a passing game. It was week 1 against Chattanooga. They did not throw for over 300 yards in any game against an FBS team this season. You look at Ohio State's schedule, and they played Oregon, but then there's no one else that's really comparable from an offensive standpoint that's on their schedule. I mean, who is it? Is it Indiana? Is it Penn State? Which we know, like, Penn State looked really good against Oregon, but over the course of their other 12 games, they didn't look very good offensively. Is it Nebraska? I mean, so I think, to my point here is Ohio State is elite, and they are very good, but Tennessee is not Oregon, and Oregon is going to be by far the most talented team that they've played on offense this season. And to your point, Eric, the over-the-top stuff that they hit, it really opened up everything in the middle. And you touched on it. Dylan Gabriel's best games of the year have come against the toughest opponents they've played. And I think he's the better quarterback than Will Howard is. And I think Oregon's offense has the better offensive line, especially with Ohio State having their injuries up front now there. And we should also note, like, in that first meeting, Oregon lost Trayshawn Holden, second quarter of that game because he spit on a player. That's another storyline in and of itself of that individual matchup. But how Holden impacts this game. They're gonna get Jordan Birch, who didn't even play in that game, back. So again, like, I'm just trying to curtail a little bit of this woe is me. Oh my God, Ohio State's unbelievable. They're unbeatable. Oregon is by far the best team that they will have faced all year. They're going to play them a second time now. Adjustments will be made, and I think that's like curious where adjustments come from, but on both sides. But Oregon has by far the best offense that Ohio State's played, and they gave up almost like 550 yards to Oregon in that game.
What Ohio State's defense has done since the Oregon game, they've generated a ton more pressure on quarterbacks, mostly because they could not really generate too much pressure. They had some moments of pressure against Dylan Gabriel, but Oregon's offensive line is pretty good, so it's not nothing to be upset about. But Ohio State started to generate more pressure by sending more guys. They're doing different kind of blitzes, more simulated pressures, rushing forward down linemen, but bringing guys off the edge. Which really helps when, like to Matt's point, when they're playing inferior quarterbacks, when they don't have the cognition to understand where the guy is coming from, that maybe like a first or second year guy just doesn't know because he can't read a defense as well as a third, fourth, fifth, sixth for some reason guy can understand how to read those defenses. And I'm interested to see Matt ended his by talking about what changes our team's going to make. I'm really interested to see what Oregon and Ohio State do on that front, because Dylan Gabriel's old enough and has done a much better job throughout the season of understanding pressures that are coming off the edges or simulated pressures and calling out blitz schemes. And the offensive line has done a better job of picking those up. Guys rotating out, picking up a blitzing safety, whatever the case is. Jordan James did a good job last time against Ohio State, taking on Latham Ransom. I think that's going to be one of the biggest storylines for me going into the week, is just how are they going to approach this? Because this is a big shift for Ohio State, who has predominantly the last couple of years just relied on their four guys who have had a bunch of talent there. And last time these guys played, Oregon handled it. They did a good job. They were able to provide enough time in the pocket for DG to step up and throw those deep balls that we all started this conversation with to Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson. Like, is that going to be the game plan again? Just sending four guys and hoping your defense does the job against Oregon's wide receiving talent? I don't think that's going to be the case. So I'm really interested in that. That was a big change in Ohio State's defense. And, you have to feel good about the way that Oregon's offense is playing. Everybody's healed up. There's going to be practices and stuff like that, but everybody was healed up for the Penn State game. Tez Johnson looked amazing. You still have Evan Stewart, who didn't do anything in the Penn State game, but is a weapon at any point. And like we said, Trayshawn Holden's back. The offensive line is healthy now. More than healthy, because they have Nashad Strother, Dave Aiuli, Marcus Harper now to kind of rotate in at guards. And so you're wondering, what will that look like? But regardless, you're going to have a starting guard wherever it is. And it's going to just be a tough matchup. Oregon's defense, we could get to that, but it's going to be, I don't know how it's not going to be another 2-3 point game this time around, as well as the Rose Bowl. I think these are two of the best. I think these are the two best teams in college football, like I said earlier. And it's going to be a pleasure to watch them at the Rose Bowl on the 1st of January.
To your point, Jared, on the chess match between these coaching staffs, I think one thing that Oregon's done a really good job of, with Will and with Kenny before this, to mitigate some of that pressure and bringing in extra numbers is having answers behind it in terms of those quick hitters. Like, that's people are really critical of, check down merchants. They take that's because if you bring extra players, there's usually somebody underneath who you can get the ball up to quickly, right? And I do think that has mitigated some of why teams don't bring 6 or bring 7 or really just bring the house, is because Oregon's offense is constructed in a way that there are usually easy passes to connect on quickly that, maybe go for bigger yards because there's less defenders on the field. So I will be curious on that side of things. And to your point, like, how aggressive does Ohio State feel comfortable getting? What's the result of that early? What are the counters throughout the game? And this is stuff we'll get to when we get further into the matchup as the game gets a little closer. But that's a really good point, and I will be curious to see kind of how like Oregon schemes it, and similar to like how Penn State schemed against Oregon's defensive front, and kind of took away some of that pass rush and that aggression because of all the stuff that Kotelnicki was able to do. Like that's kind of the chess match that's always fun to follow. And then I guess kind of just the last thing I have here in terms of this game is kind of just like the individual players who like where is Trayshawn's head going into this one, right? Like you brought that up earlier, and I was like, we haven't talked to him from an interview perspective since that happened. He'll be available to speak before it. I'll be curious to hear where his head's at. Like, is this a game where he feels like he needs to make a statement, or is this a game where he's kind of all in his own head because of what happened last time, and now he's the opposite of Ingvenosen again, and like, are there, what's the impact there? And then on the other side for Ohio State, I go like Denzel Burke. Like that was a huge storyline coming out. This is like one of the best corners in the country. He got cooked a couple of times by Oregon receivers downfield. I guarantee you this is a game he's been circling. If they could get this rematch as an opportunity to show like those guys got the better of me last time, that's not going to happen again. And like, so what's the outcome there? And then the obvious one's Will Howard, who played a really good game for 59 minutes and 30 seconds of that, maybe more, up until the very last sequence there. And that's been, I'm sure, something, and Matt's already alluded to it. He's talked about how they really wanted to play this game, how they're ready for it. Like, what is that kind of emotional impact of this game in a rematch? Because, and Matt was doing research on this before we jumped on, like, we don't see rematches in college football within a season all that often. I know we just saw, a couple of Oregon-Washington games a year ago, but that's like not something that necessarily happens a lot. And I'll just be curious of kind of like what this first game, what the impacts of that are. I know we won't get direct answers on that from anybody probably, or we'll get limited going in at least, but like that's going to play, like these are humans. We have to remember that. And that first game was a huge game and one that was played on a big stage, and there's definitely emotions still attached to it. So I'll be curious to see kind of like what the impacts of that are, because again, this isn't something that happens every season where you necessarily play a team for a second time.
Eric, I don't think I agree with your like Trayshawn, Will, Guy, Denzel, like guys that performed poorly or maybe had negative moments in the game. I also think it flips the other side. Like a guy like Nico, like that was probably like his coming out party where it was, wow, he's really, really good. And can you now do it again against the same opponent? I look at this game and there's going to be players that had big moments. Dante Manning was another one that had a really good performance in that game. Can you show up and can you do it again when you kind of played above what was at that time above your weight class per se? And that's going to be another one that pops up. I'm sure there's going to be guys on Ohio State's side that it will also be the same case of, hey, you played really well in this game, way above the level that you normally play at. Can you now do it again? And those are going to be just as important as the Denzel Burks, the Trayshawn Holdens, the Will Howards, the guys that had maybe a bad taste in their mouth, how the game ended for them individually. Derek Harmon in that Ohio State game was unbelievably good. And he has been unbelievably good all year, but I think that was maybe his best game. Maybe, I mean, I'm trying to think of other performances. I got his Pro Football Focus up, and it is his highest graded game all year. Idaho was the second closest. His run defense in that game was 95, which is just ludicrous. Can you replicate that again? Can you? I mean, I don't think it's going to be. Can you be at that level again? Because that's really hard to do. But can you get close to that? And how many other guys play close to what the level that they did, and who doesn't? This is awesome. This is gonna be like the fourth matchup I could find back to 76 that it's a repeat performance. Oregon is 1-2 in the previous three. Eric mentioned the most recent one. They lost to Washington in the Pac-12 championship game last year. They lost to Utah in the Pac-12 championship game in 2021. And then they beat Arizona in the Pac-12 championship game in 2014. So there's never been, to my knowledge, since at least 76, that Oregon's played a team in, I guess, playoff / bowl game that's a repeat performance. So this is a first, but they've done it before in like a conference championship game of a repeat game, and it's 1 and 2. Those teams are so different, players are different, coaches are different. It doesn't really matter,
Right.
but nonetheless, it's something that just doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, no, absolutely not, which makes it even more fun that it's going to be not only a rematch that doesn't happen often, but a rematch in the college football playoffs where probably, again, the two best teams in the country, in my opinion, are squaring off yet again, but this time at the Rose Bowl. Yeah, I don't have too much else. It's a hair too early to really dive deep into it, but we'll have plenty of stuff on the site and podcast-wise over the next 10 days leading up to the game. But I'm excited. This is the game that I wanted. I know Oregon fans probably would have wanted Tennessee. I think it would have been an easier game to win. Not that Tennessee wouldn't give it their best or anything like that, but certainly a better team in Ohio State. And it's just more fun. The two best teams in the country squaring off against each other. Like that's what we all want to see. Unfortunately, it's not for the national championship game, which is where this is like people are dubbing this the real national championship game. But I still think it's going to be a hoot. This is the matchup I wanted. I think this is the matchup that Dan Lanning and his staff wanted. They're here to prove it, just like Ohio State is. So we'll see who the best team is eventually.
My last thing is just, hey, it's kind of a traditional Rose Bowl matchup, right? Like, I mean, I know it's technically Big Ten, but this is Big Ten, Pac-12. This is what these games are supposed to look like. And Oregon and Ohio State have already played in a Rose Bowl before. And these are the colors that you're supposed to see on New Year's Day in Pasadena. And I'll be excited to be down there. The three of us will all be there to cover this thing, which is going to be a blast. And I mean, like to Jared's point, like again, maybe it's not the matchup all the fans we're hoping for, but in terms of just like what's the most exciting two brands right now facing each other, two brands that have had their meetings on the field, but also in recruiting. Like we can't, don't forget about that part. Like Oregon just, flipped a big time 5-star recruit on signing day a couple weeks ago. Oregon just out kind of recruited Ohio State to get Dylan Lindemann from Purdue, who's that kind of recruitment came down to those schools. So like, these are recruiting rivals, and for these two to meet is going to be really fascinating. And I think we're treated for another really fun competitive football game. And maybe the outcome will be the winner of this game wins it all. I don't know if that'll be the case or not, but I certainly feel like the winner of that game will probably be perceived as the favorite to win the rest of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. We'll be back later this week with some more podcasts. And then, as Eric mentioned, we'll be traveling down this time next week to get to the Rose Bowl to start coverage on site between number 1 seed Oregon, number 8 seed Ohio State. But until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.